Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Father. It's really nice to be here. And just for those who didn't quite catch my name, it's Ron Tesoriero. I've just come back, as Tim said, from South America. Over there they have no trouble with my name. It's a Latin name. But they have trouble with Willesse. So it's good to get even. Anyhow, Tim, thank you very much for the kind introduction, and also for showing those two clips, which in a way give you an introduction to the type of work that Mike Willesse and I have been doing for a number of years. Having grown up a Catholic and gone to school and heard about all of these saints that lived in history, saints like St. Francis, Padre Pio, St. Catherine of Siena, people who almost feel like today, like fairy tales, because the world we live in today can't quite cope with the fact that there may be people who have existed in history who have had the claims that St. Francis of Assisi had, like the Stigmata, or St. Catherine of Siena, who, under guidance by God the Father, wrote great treatises on the faith. And so when I came back to the faith in my, I suppose, middle 30s or 40s, I began to question some of these things that we were taught, and wondered, how do these claims of the Catholic Church measure up to science? As most of you know today, it's not trendy to believe in God, and it's difficult to contend with the belief that God was the creator when we're faced with a scientific world that wants to tell us otherwise. And you can imagine the dilemma that school kids today have when they go to school and go into the science class and they're told that we were not created, that we are a product of a big bang, of an evolutionary process, and that we have evolved from primitive forms to human beings. That student comes out of the science class and goes into the religion class. And in the religion class, he's taught that there's a God who created us. He created us for a purpose. He's a loving God. And if that kid went to a Catholic school, he'd also be told that Jesus is present in the Eucharist. Now you can imagine the dilemma and the burden that student has in life when he walks out into the real world, and they say to him, "What, you really believe that God is in a piece of bread?" I mean, they say that God doesn't exist, but you believe he's in a piece of bread. Well, tonight the stories we're going to tell you are going to lift that burden, because the stories will make every scientist and every theologian think. The first story, there are two stories I want to present. Mike Willesse will expand on those and tell you more about the story of the making of signs from God. But the first story I want to bring to your attention is the one that Tim in this last part of that segment showed, which is this story of a statue of Christ in South America that has been weeping and bleeding. You see it on the screen here. I'd begun studying with a professor from South America, mystic experiences in the modern times. And it was in 1995 that he called me and said, "Would you like to help me in the study of a statue of Christ that's crying and bleeding in Bolivia?" And of course, you can imagine on hearing that, how you would think. When most people would say, what's the point of going there and examining something that's impossible to happen? And so from my point of view, my background is a lawyer, I thought, well, I can't lose on this exercise. If it's a fraud, well, I can exhibit it as such. If it's true, what a great story. So I went over to Bolivia in 1995. When I had arrived there, Dr. Caston had already taken a sample of blood from this statue that had wept some months previously. And we'd taken that sample for the purpose of examining it. And there was the size of the sample that we had taken for examination. But prior to doing tests on the blood, I went and interviewed a number of people who had seen the statue weep and bleed before I had arrived. And one significant witness was a journalist from the local television station who said he was asked to go there out of duty, not out of devotion, to actually film the happenings at this little place where the statue was. And he said to me that they went there and set up a camera in front of the statue and allowed it to roll continuously. And he said, first of all, I noticed that a clear tear had begun to fall from one of the eyes, and with a small cloth he was able to capture that tear. He said he then allowed the camera to continue to roll, and there was no intervention by anyone around it, and that the statue began to bleed from the head and from the eyes. And then with a cloth, he wiped some of the blood off onto that cloth. And I asked him, is it possible that anyone could have interfered with that statue whilst you were there and not noticed it? He said it's impossible because the camera was rolling the whole time and that there's no way that anyone intervened to make it happen. And he was convinced that it happened of its own accord. On that same day that I interviewed that journalist, I was filming myself the statue, and I noticed that it had begun to get very wet around the eyes. I put my finger on the eye and my finger became very wet. In a few moments that water dissolved from my finger, but it continued to permeate through the eyes of the statue. And then later on, in allowing the film to continue to roll, this statue began to shed tears. And if you see the next sequence, you'll see the tear that develop and fall. That was quite impressive. And of course, the question is, if there's liquid coming from a statue, then it's only two ways it could happen. Either it's been applied from the outside, or it's from some mechanism that's on the inside. So we then took the statue away and had it x-rayed in this scanning device, which was able to do segmental cuts through the statue, and from it they were able to determine there was actually nothing inside it. And even if there was a perforation in the plaster the thickness of a human hair, they said that they would find it. So the explanation for the weeping was not from any mechanism inside or from the outside. It was weeping and bleeding of its own accord. So the next question was, what was the result from the blood test? We took a number of samples of blood and we submitted it to testing at a number of laboratories. The first one was a genetic testing laboratory in the United States that we were encouraged to use as being the best genetic testing device laboratory in the United States at the time. That was in 1995. And they found that whilst it passed the test of blood, it was human, it had all the physical characteristics of blood, they could not get that blood to yield the genetic profile of the author. Now, we all know when we go to the supermarket and we look at a product, there's a barcode on that product which identifies the product. Each of us as human beings have a barcode, a genetic code that's given to us by our mother and father. In this case, we could not get a code. So we had to do more testing. We brought different samples, as well as those samples from the first two tests, to a crime laboratory in New South Wales, Australia, and they got exactly the same results as the American laboratory. And the scientists there said, the results I've got are not the results I would expect to get if someone had put their blood in or on a statue, because their genetic code would show up in that blood. We did more tests and two more samples were given to the Professor of Legal Medicine, Rome University, and they also had the same problem. Dr. Fiore said it was human blood, but they could not obtain a genetic profile. He says, I have no explanation for this unusual phenomenon. So there's something very intriguing about the blood. It's not something that a human being could do by extracting from their own blood this result, something very curious in the blood. But the intrigue goes on because we took two dry encrusted blood scabs from the face of the statue and had them independently tested by different pathologists. And the pathologist in question here was Dr. Lawrence from California. He was not told anything of the history of the sample. We gave this little blood crust to him to have a look at, and he tells us, I've had a look at it, I can tell you what it is. It seems to me to be a piece of dried blood that's been pulled from the face of a person because it has intermeshed with it epidermal cells that seem to have been dragged with it as the blood scab has been pulled. But he says also there's also the process of healing that's occurred in there because the white blood cells have interacted with the tissue to form the fibrin of the scab, so that this would say, in summary, to be a piece of dried blood pulled from the face of a person. And then when Mike said, but this was pulled from the face of a statue, the scientist said, well, I can tell you it's not a statue. then he said, "Oh, I'm having a hard time in my mind trying to work this out." So that was number one. The second sample we took to another pathologist, and the actual pathology slide of that sample is shown up on the screen, and there's this massive material at the bottom of the bottom section of the screen, which was first difficult to identify until we had a particular type of pathologist to examine it. And he says, "This looks to me like a piece of a blood sample that has intermixed with it traumatised tissue. It's tissue that's been traumatised through like severe beating, and it has traumatised the skin and intermeshed with the blood." And of course, again, this is from a plaster statue. It's almost taken on human characteristics because it has cried, it has bled, it has wounds consistent with some sort of adverse treatment, some battering, and it also has blood which has characteristics which don't follow normal, not the normal results we get from examining the blood of a person. Of course, we have to ask ourselves the question, we're talking about a plaster statue, not a human person. This plaster statue has taken on the attributes of a human being. But science has no explanation for how a plaster statue can be producing these human characteristics. And the question is, do we leave this as one of those things that we just can't explain, or do we take it further? As rational people, we say, well, if science can't provide an answer, there has to be an answer somewhere. And then the next part of the progression of finding an answer, logically, would be to say, well, this is not a statue of Winston Churchill or Julius Caesar that's weeping and bleeding. It's a particular person who in history had very special characteristics. He was Jesus, who lived 2,000 years ago, whose history was recorded, and very much about his history was unique in that he was a person who claimed to be one with God, and that in order to make palatable to a world who didn't believe, he performed miracles so that they would believe, and in the message that he had to impart to them. And so that's the first, I suppose, inspiration one gets by looking at the image. But the second thing is that this image of Jesus is one of him as he was before Pontius Pilate. Many of you will remember the Mel Gibson movie where they dramatically present that scene where Jesus is roped and denied his freedom and dragged before Pilate, and the people clamour for his execution. And these were the people who had previously applauded him for who he was, who had seen his miracles, and they had turned, and that in response to that, Pilate had him brought out and whipped, crowned with thorns, beaten, punched, and given a treatment most unbefitting to the King of Kings, to the creator of the universe. And so in a sense that this image that's weeping has a lot of poetry in it, because it was man of 2,000 years ago that did that to him. And the question is, why is it happening now today? Why are we being reminded through this image? In fact, when the scientists couldn't find an answer to why the statue was weeping, they said, you should go and ask a theologian. And I did. And the theologian said, well, if this is coming from God, you'll find the answer in the Bible. He said, go to the Bible, Luke, I think it's 23 or 19, where it's that scene where Jesus is coming into Jerusalem and the people are applauding him, they're waving palms, they're laying down their cloaks on the road. Jesus comes in on a donkey, and they say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And the Pharisees said to Jesus, are you going to allow these people to praise you like that? And Jesus says, if you shall silence them, then the stones will cry out. And the theologian says, Jesus was prophesying that there would come a time when something very unusual would happen, that stones that normally are callous, cold, inactive, would take on the attributes of being able to communicate a message, the message that he was divine. and that this message was for today. Man no longer proclaims him, and the stones are crying out in proclamation. That is a very interesting case. I don't think there's been a modern case or any case in history which has been studied as much as this statue and has given as much for science to probe as this statue. But it's the blood that we're particularly interested in, and the characteristics it has, and that forms the link to the next story that I want to tell you briefly about. Mike Willesse and I were asked if we would assist this professor in examining a case in Buenos Aires, Argentina. And the story is that this priest, Father Zep, found in his church after Mass an abandoned communion host. Now, normally the protocol is if the host falls on the floor of the church, the priest will consume it, but if it's dirty, they'll normally put it into a bowl, allow the host to dissolve, and then do something with it that's more sacred than just throwing it away. And in this case, the priest put the bowl into a tabernacle and locked the tabernacle. And then in 2 or 3 days, he opened up the tabernacle and noticed that a blood-like substance had begun to come from the host, and that was photographed. And you'll see there it was, just probably about 8 or so days afterwards, and there it is from a side view. You can still see the host visible with the transformation occurring around it. And then a few days later, 6th of September, you can see that the blood has increased in quantity, and there it is from the side. Quite a significant transformation from the host that existed a matter of 3 weeks beforehand. And so the Cardinal of the city gave permission for us to carry out an examination of this. That was in 1999, some 3 years after the event. And the interviews were taken of the various priests involved, and there was how it was in 1999 when we were permitted to take a tiny piece away for examination. There you see the severing of a piece for examination. There's the piece we took away. We were given complete freedom to do whatever tests that we wanted to on this. We weren't in any way directed by the church to do it. It was to be an independent examination, and then our report was to be given back to the church after that examination was complete. The first tests that were done were DNA tests. And interestingly, again, the DNA test showed that there was the presence of human DNA, but it would not yield the genetic profile of the author. So we had a second case where there was something special about the blood. Also, they found that there was the evidence of both flesh and blood in this sample. And we then had to identify what that flesh was. There you see, if anyone's conversant with pathology, you can see there how our sample looked. It didn't look exactly like normal cardiac muscle, but we eventually found out why. We went to a forensic pathologist in the United States, New York. He was told nothing about the story, and he wanted to know, of course, what we're looking at. And we said, no, it's important for you to do this as a blind test. So Mike and I were there, watching him look down that microscope, awaiting his answer, and he says, I can tell you exactly what this is. This flesh is part of the muscle of the heart. It's the muscle that gives the heart its beat and the body its life. And he says, I can see infiltrated through this tissue white blood cells. And that tells me two things. That this heart was alive at this moment, the moment that this sample was taken. And also those white blood cells go to address injury. So this heart has suffered. And then he mentioned further, he says, this is the sort of thing I see in people who have been, or in patients that I've seen, who have been beaten severely around the chest. Now, you can imagine that. This man is giving to us a story through this microscope that's very much consistent with one we're familiar with. So when you find a case like this, you say, well, is this unique? Has it ever occurred in history? And we do know that in the history of the church, there have been other cases where there have been Eucharistic miracles. The famous one in Orvieto in Italy, but the one I want to refer particularly to is the one in the 9th century in Lanciano in Italy. In that case, a priest who had doubts about the transubstantiation, at the time of the consecration, as he elevated the host turned to flesh and the wine turned to blood. And that those relics from the 8th century still exist today. When they were examined in 1970 by Professor Linoli, he found that this tissue was from the muscle of the heart. And it turns out it's from the same muscle of the heart as we found in our modern case. So in a sense, that's sort of a confirmation both of his finding and ours, that two Eucharistic miracles 1,200 years apart are so precise in their ability to be able to be compared. So the question then is, what does this mean? And I think that theologians will have a lot to draw from these scientific findings. That a piece of bread should turn into flesh and blood is something that's not within the realms of science. There's no book of science that can tell you that a piece of bread has the ability, or under any conditions, can turn into living flesh. But we do know that there is some explanation in some book that this is possible. And that book is the book written 2,000 years ago, where Jesus spoke about his bread becoming his body and blood. And so the question is, from the scientific point of view, when you're trying to probe for answers to these difficult questions, are you entitled to go to a book like the Bible to find the answer? Well, so far, that book is the only book that has any reference to what has, or a potential explanation for what has happened. But we know in our faith, our Catholic faith, that we're taught that at the time of the consecration, the bread and wine become the body and blood of Christ. We know that it's a very difficult concept to understand, and in fact Protestants and also many Catholics have difficulty with that concept. The concept that Jesus Christ becomes present, really present, body and blood, soul and divinity in the Eucharist. It's a magnificent thing, if it's true, to think that the creator of the universe comes into our presence at the moment of the consecration, and that when you receive him in communion, Jesus Christ himself enters into you. And of course, what this story does is help us accept that difficult concept of our faith, that Jesus is present. The contrary view is that it's only symbolic, that Jesus is not really there in flesh and blood, but only is symbolically there. That's what the Protestants believe. In fact, that was the basis for the Reformation in the 16th century. And for all of those years, Protestants have had this misconception about the nature of the Eucharist. Imagine how valuable this story is to show that Jesus is telling us something in this story, that he's not there symbolically, he's there really present in the Eucharist. But also, for us Catholics, the fact that we have a finding of heart muscle must be also uplifting, because if Jesus' heart is in the Eucharist, then that's more than we could ever have expected. I don't think that it's hard to find any theological basis for the argument that Jesus has his heart in the Eucharist, but we see this scientifically. Yet there are many devotions to Jesus' heart, and they talk about the Eucharistic heart of Jesus. So there's a lot of references to it. But in this story, we're given a really great boost in our understanding of the Eucharist, to think that Jesus gives to us that part of him which is the core of his divinity. We think of the heart as being the symbol of love. The sacrament is called the sacrament of love, the sacrament whereby Jesus gives his all for our benefit. It's also linked with the concept of his sacred heart. It's also linked with the concept of his mercy. Earlier tonight, before we began the meeting, we were looking at the devotion to the divine mercy. And the divine mercy image itself, you'll recall, Jesus points to his heart, which is the fount of mercy. So I'm sure that theologians will find great value in an examination of the science to link it with what we understand in our faith of the nature of the heart of Jesus. But not only will this story have great impetus and value for the Catholic Church, but also for science. just try and get your head around this concept. A piece of bread has transformed into living heart tissue. Something that had no life has been given human life. The first thing that rises from that is, in the year of the priesthood, think of this, that the power of the priest to be invoke God to convert bread into living human flesh is an incredible power. And that's in fact what we are told is the power of the priest, and of course in this scientific exercise we see it confirmed. But for science, they're going to have, there's no book of science, as I say again, that can explain how a piece of bread can turn to flesh and blood. And think of also the ramifications that in this instance we're talking about something which has had no life, has been given human life. If we listen to the scientists, they say we exist because of an evolutionary process through a Big Bang. God had no part in that process. But this case is going to make them rethink, because here we have human life that's come into existence other than through an evolutionary process. The importance of this case for humanity. The world proceeds on the basis that God doesn't exist. Pick up any newspaper, look at any television program. If you express a belief in God, people think that you're soft in the head. You've got no scientific basis for that belief. It's children's stuff. It's not real stuff. And so God is relegated to a very secondary category. But if God is elevated to the position where he should be, then we are all children of God, that we have an eternal destiny, and then our life takes on a different proportion. And so I see that these cases will have an important role in trying to reorientate humanity to the consciousness that there is a God, he is an active God, and he acts in this world today. Now, I want to just run on to a really nice thought here. Many of you have seen that image. It's the Shroud of Turin, believed to be the burial cloth of Christ. On it, inexplicably, is an image. For over 100 years, scientists have been looking at it, trying to work out how that image is formed. They can't explain it. It's not a painting. There's no human way in which that image is formed, yet it depicts an image of a man who has had the experiences of a passion and the crucifixion as described in the Bible of Jesus, and yet that appears inexplicably on that cloth. When photography was invented, they took a photograph of the shroud and then looked at the negative in the dark room. And there you see an image, a positive image of a man standing. Has anyone ever not seen that before? Everyone's seen it. You know? And what I say to myself, isn't it amazing? This image, this is a presentation of the art of photography that seemed to have existed well before the invention of photography. Because if this image was created in the year, 100, back in year 33, over 1900 years ago, how could anyone have created put information on a cloth that could only be read with the advent of photography some 1900 years later? And that was like a time capsule waiting for the advent of photography. But we believe there's another time capsule involved, because there is on that cloth blood, and the blood is located where the wounds of the crucifixion would be, the hands and the feet, and particularly the side there. So what we're interested in doing is being able to compare that blood with these two samples here. The top scene there is the one of the Eucharistic miracle in Argentina. And you can see those black dots there. That represents life. That's white blood cells. And inside that, in the nucleus of a cell, and there's a whole wealth of information in there. But what's interesting is that reflects injury done to a heart. Here is the statue of Christ with the blood. In both cases, the genetic information that we should normally find in the blood isn't there. So that these present themselves as very interesting comparisons ultimately with the blood from the image from the Shroud of Turin. if these are indeed true Eucharistic, true miracles involving the blood of Christ, then those three samples should match. Now, the next thing is, if the blood does match, imagine the consequences. This blood is blood from a dead person, but this blood is alive. Those white blood cells show that it's living. The person who was dead with that blood is now alive here. Interesting, isn't it? So we wait, hopefully, for our future work to be able to make that comparison. And if it does, you can imagine the consequence of that will have for our faith, for our understanding of the Eucharist, and our belief in Jesus Christ. I thank you.
Thanks, Ron. Thanks for having us here, Father. I was brought up a Catholic, but I lost my faith in my teenage years and became a journalist, and I became a very successful journalist, and I think that probably added to my inability to see God or see the need for God, because when you're successful, it's easier to think, well, I'm doing okay, I'm doing this by myself and I don't really need any help. And I continued in that manner for a long time. Things maybe started to change about 11 years ago. I was flying into the Sudan up in northern Africa, where there was a civil war and it was very difficult to get in. I was in Nairobi in Kenya, and with the film crew we chartered a light aircraft who agreed to go in and fly under the radar. So it was going to be dangerous at the other end of this trip, but there was no danger sitting on the tarmac in that light aircraft in Nairobi. I must add that as a journalist I became a very sceptical journalist about most things. Sitting on the tarmac, I suddenly had a premonition that this plane would crash. And it was so strong that I realised I wasn't thinking it might crash, I knew it would crash. The problem was, being so sceptical, I did not believe in premonitions. So I had this internal dilemma. You know, my feeling was so strong, the plane is going to crash. But my logic is saying, how stupid are you? It doesn't happen like that. There's no supernatural, there's no premonitions. Use your brain. And also I didn't really know how to get off. It was my plane, I'd chartered it, had a film crew. So in the end I did nothing. I just sat on the plane and it thundered down the runway and took off and flew 200 or 300 feet into the air and then stalled. And the plane tail started to drop and the nose went higher and higher, and just for one moment it seemed to just stop in the air, then started to fall and spiral. And the only thought I can remember having was, I was right. So the plane crashed very severely, knocking down 20 or 30 trees, and a couple of big rocks came up through the plane and the bottom half was wiped off completely. One wing almost tore off and the plane never flew again. But we all got out of it. There was just one extra thing. As we were thundering down the runway, I said my first prayer in 35 years. I said, Father, I place my friends and me in your hands. The plane did crash. Against all the odds, we got out of it. And I had said that prayer, and I had been given that premonition. Was that just a coincidence? Well, of course it could have been. I finished the work in the Sudan and went back to Sydney, and Ron Tesoriero called me, as he had done quite a few times before, to tell me about these supernatural events in Bolivia. I said, Ron, they don't happen. You know, as an investigative reporter, I've looked into supernatural allegations on many occasions. On every occasion, I found fraud. Money, cult, ego, but fraud. And he persisted, and on this occasion he said to me, you're making a judgment without investigating, and you're supposed to be an investigative journalist. So I'm challenging you to come to Bolivia and take a look for yourself. So I gave in, and instead of flying back to Africa, where I really wanted to go for the next story, I flew to Bolivia with Ron. And I saw the bleeding statue, and that I figured I would be able to find what was causing the bleeding and the tears. But I couldn't find it. It didn't bleed while I was there. It didn't tear. And I looked at the results from the laboratories that Ron had got and saw there was no DNA. I thought that was suspicious. Ron argued, well, if the owner or someone else had placed their blood on the statue and we'd taken that blood to the laboratory, we would have got the DNA profile of the person who put his or her blood on the statue. I accepted that, but the fact that the laboratory couldn't provide a DNA profile just left me suspicious. And it was a unique case, so I just didn't buy into it. I put it to one side. Then I met Katia Rivas, and there was certainly something special about her. I didn't see the stigmata on this visit, but I saw her writings, and I saw some of Ron's videotape. On one occasion, he filmed for more than 1 hour as she was writing, and her pen virtually doesn't leave the page, which is very, very difficult to do. Even an expert in his field, writing about his expertise, will always at some time pause to think of the next sentence or the construction of a sentence or even the spelling of a word, but she doesn't. And that was pretty impressive, and I read some of the messages, and though I wasn't a very spiritual person and certainly absolutely not a religious person, I could see there was a lot of depth and some beautiful writing, which seemed to be well beyond her capacity. Also, she has biblical references as she writes, suddenly a reference, Matthew chapter whatever, in the same flow without having to stop and think about it. So I sort of sensed there was something there, but I thought, what do I do about it? I can't find fraud on the one hand with the statue or with Katia. On the other hand, I can't really endorse it. I can't say it's authentic. So I said, sorry, Ron, I just really can't do anything about this. I knew that he'd got me there in the hope that I would find it authentic and give publicity to it, because he believed that it was the work of God and it needed to be promoted. People needed to know these stories. And I knew he was praying that I guess I was the only journalist he knew and that I would be the answer. Well, I wasn't, I thought. We got back to Sydney, and one of the television networks in Australia was doing a documentary on me and asked my secretary if there was any visual footage of what I'd been doing recently, and she provided some, including saying, we'll call Ron Tesoriero because he's been to Bolivia with Mike, and I think he shot some footage, which he had. So almost as a throwaway, at the end of this documentary about me, there was just a reference to me going to Bolivia privately to look at these supernatural matters. There were no conclusions, just that I'd done it. And the head of the Fox network in the United States saw this documentary, and he knew my work, and he called me and he said, did you really go on a private trip as a journalist? And I said, yes. He said, that's, journalists don't do that, I would have given you money to do that. I said, oh, well, I just did it. And he said, do you think there's anything in it? And for some reason, I don't really know why, I said, yes. He said, great, I want to commission you to do a special for the Fox network. And I said, okay. So there's Ron praying to get some publicity for what he sees as God's message. He takes me, a journalist, there, and I don't respond. But someone else intervenes and invites me not to do a story in Australia, but for all the world. And in fact, there were 28 million people actually saw live that night in North America, the final result. So Ron prayed that this journalist that he knew would be the conduit to get this message out to the world. And it happened, without me trying to make it happen. Now, was that a coincidence? It still could be. So I accept the commission and find myself flying back to Bolivia with Ron. We had to change aircraft at Buenos Aires in Argentina, and in the old terminal there in 1999 by then, it was very, very crowded. People were jostling to get to the counter, and I had a backpack with my travelling wallet, a larger than normal wallet for overseas travelling, passport, tickets, credit cards, and $15,000 in cash for any contingencies. Felt a tug on my backpack, turned around, and I saw a woman disappearing, looked, my wallet was gone. And I couldn't believe the feeling that came over me. I'm a very experienced journalist. I've had a lot of things go wrong. But suddenly I was devastated. I suddenly realised how important this story was becoming to me. It wasn't just another story. And from somewhere deep inside of me, here's someone who doesn't know if God exists, I said, Jesus, not now. Ron said, what's happening? What's happening? I said, we're not going anywhere. Lost my wallet, tickets, passport, cash. We're not getting on the plane. I'm thinking ahead. It's the weekend ahead of us. Australian embassies, no embassy in Argentina. You know, we're really in trouble. And Ron looked as devastated as I felt. And then I looked over his shoulder and I saw this thief walking back through the crowd towards me, holding up my wallet. She walked towards me and gave it to me, then disappeared as quickly as she'd come. Ron said, check it. I said, there's no need to. And there wasn't. When we did open the wallet, it was all there. The thief had just got away with $15,000 and brought it back after my second prayer in 35 years. Was that a coincidence? It could have been, but I was starting to think that it wasn't. And when you look at those three coincidences and line them up, they were very well aligned and pointing in the one direction. Tell the world that I'm here and that there's a reason for it. So we went ahead to make this special for the Fox network, and it was going very well. It was, we were commissioned to do 1 hour, it became 2 hours. And I didn't get very far with the bleeding statue because we still had the problem of the lack of a DNA profile. I did fly to Rome and talk to Dr. Fiore, the head of the forensic department at Gemelli Hospital. And he said, I was checking on Ron's work, and I went there just to see exactly what he would say, and he said, I have never had this experience before. I tried again and again and again to get the DNA profile because it was human blood, it was fresh, it contained DNA, and I just cannot explain to you why we can't get this profile. But that still wasn't good enough for me as a journalist to present to my audience, well, here's a mystery and I don't know what it means, and the scientists don't know what it means. So I let it go at that. We thought that Cartier would have the stigmata on Good Friday, and I told the Fox network that that's what we'd be doing. And we went, and as you saw on that clip that Tim put together, we were disappointed, but we got a message from Jesus through Cartier saying that this wasn't the time, and come back on the day after the feast of my body. Now, firstly, that was very important for us because it was a prophecy. Now, this gave me a very real chance to test Cartier, because if it didn't happen on that specific day, then you'd have to question whether she was authentic. And that was part of the purpose of the program, to test the authenticity of these things and this person. We were a bit confused about why Jesus would use this language, come back the day after the feast of my body. Why didn't he just say June the 4th or the Feast of Corpus Christi or... But Jesus has his own way. We didn't discover until, in fact, Ron worked it out, I think, a year or even 2 years later, that in a very rare occurrence, the Feast of Corpus Christi can move and the Feast of the Sacred Heart can move, and in that year they moved back to back. And in fact, we witnessed the stigmata on the Feast of his Sacred Heart. But her suffering started the night before, on the Feast of Corpus Christi, when she experienced some of the agony that Jesus experienced in the Garden of Gethsemane. We were sitting having supper the night before, and she suddenly became depressed and withdrew from the conversation. We actually have some film of her just sitting quietly, which was unlike her. She's a very easygoing, down-to-earth, natural person. And she suddenly got up and left the room. And I thought, I'll follow her. So I did, and she had gone into her oratory and was kneeling before the Blessed Sacrament and sobbing. And I had an agreement with her that I could film whatever, whenever. And she was completely open. So I grabbed my cameraman and said, just quietly go in and get some footage. And it was quite sad, and it was quite disturbing to see this pain. And then we went the next day, and soon after 12 o'clock, the little drops of blood started appearing on her forehead. The biggest question I get asked is, was it self-inflicted? We had 2 cameras, 10 witnesses, and I sat there and saw the drops come one by one. It is impossible that they were self-inflicted. And to witness this and know that, even though I hadn't converted, knowing that there's a very high probability that these were the wounds, the sufferings, the passion of Jesus Christ, starting before my eyes with real blood and pain. It was an experience that is very difficult to describe, but it's a pretty deep experience, and it got worse over the 3 hours. As you saw in that footage, she looked terrible by the time she was approaching 3 o'clock. The first time she had a stigmata with full hemorrhage, with friends around, they took her to hospital. And Ricardo Castagnon, the professor you saw talking in that video, he called a doctor and explained what was happening. And the doctor said, if you hadn't explained that, I would say this woman is very close to death. She is dying. And that's exactly what we witnessed. Her lungs were becoming congested, which is the way people died on the cross. They can't breathe and their lungs filled with fluid. And Kati had 2 women holding her by the shoulders, sitting her up. It's like artificial breathing, because she couldn't breathe alone. She was so congested. And when she finally came out of it at 3 o'clock, it was like we all had to come out of it. It was agonising. And watching that beautiful priest, Father Renzo Cecilo, pray, he had tears running down his face, and it was just an enormous experience, and a very relevant one for me in my own journey through life and back towards God. The next day we went to see her, and all the wounds had disappeared. So for those who say, I don't care what you say, it was self-inflicted, say, okay, let's say it was self-inflicted. You self-inflict some wounds, cut yourself as she allegedly did, and clean them all up by tomorrow. No scars, no marks. There is no scientific explanation for that. So the program went to air and was very successful. There were some conversions, and there was a very strong response. And I was left in the... Normally if I do a story and it's a good one and you get a good response, you feel pretty good about it. And this was the biggest story I'd done, the biggest audience. But I felt after that it wasn't all over for me, and that I felt some pull, and I didn't quite understand it. I guess I knew deep down that there was more work to be done, and that wasn't just a once-off program for a special purpose, even if it really was from God. And then Katia and Father Renzo came out to Australia, and I just opened a little restaurant, and my offices were above it, and I was proud of the new restaurant, and I took Father Enzo and Cartier and the Tesorieros, and we went to have dinner there, and just as the main course was being served, Father Enzo, whose English is not great, said, "Your officers are upstairs." I said, "Yes, Father." He said, "Have you had them blessed?" And I had to keep a straight face. I mean, the idea of having your officers blessed when you haven't had yourself blessed just seemed funny to me, but out of respect, I kept a straight face and said, "No, I haven't had them blessed, Father." He said, "Would you like me to bless them?" And politely, I just said, "Oh, yes, Father, that would be nice." Thinking, well, I don't know when we'll do it, but the steak is being served. Father Enzo just stood up and walked out of the restaurant. So I had to follow him, and Cartier got up and followed me. As we're going up the stairs, I don't know why, because it hadn't been at the front of my mind, certainly, I said, "Father, sometime I would like to talk to you, sometime. Just talk about confession." And I almost choked getting the words out. But Father Enzo didn't say anything. And I thought, he's a strange priest. I thought priests had to, I'm coming back to confession after all this time, and the priest should put a piece of rope around his neck. But nothing. So we went up to my new officers. I was also very proud of my new officers, and Father Enzo went over to the little coffee room and walked in and he said, "Mike, what is this room?" I said, "He's picked the smallest, meaningless room in the place." So, "Oh, Father, that's where we make the coffee." And he walked in for this, he said, "Oh." So I dutifully followed him in. Once I was trapped inside, he turned, and the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. "How long since your last confession?" And I went so close to saying, "Father, I'm just not ready. I'm not prepared. It's difficult. 35 years, I've accumulated a lot of baggage. All these thoughts are going through my mind, but instead of saying them, I find myself saying, well," and it was an incredible experience. I'll never forget it, because apart from the fact that I was then given this great gift of faith back a second time, it also taught me the extreme value of confession. And when I left that room, we were all crying. Cartier was leaning over the couch praying and crying, and Father Enzo was crying. I was crying, but I felt like I weighed only about 3 or 4 stone. It wasn't too bad a feeling. And Cartier got up from the couch and turned to me and gave me a hug, crying. Then she reached into a dress and pulled out a holy card and gave it to me. And it was a picture of Jesus embracing the prodigal son. Now, she can't have a holy card for every occasion hidden in her dress. And she didn't know there'd be a confession. Or did she? I don't know. So then, without any formal agreement, I just seemed to tag on to Ricardo and Ron and become the 3rd member of the team. And we started making investigations around the world, and arriving especially at the 2 that Ron talked about, and I'll talk a little about that in a moment. But in the meantime, we decided we'd make a film on the Eucharist, because I was starting to understand the extraordinary intrinsic value of the Eucharist. And I also was seeing that in the Catholic Church, which I've now come back to very enthusiastically, I can see that an awful lot of Catholics who do go to I can see there are a lot of Catholics, good Catholics, regular Sunday Mass goers, who didn't seem to understand the value of the Eucharist. You can see that in the fact that you go to confession, there's only 3 or 4 people there, but you go to Mass on Sunday and there's 500 people in one Mass every Sunday receiving the Eucharist. And the figures just don't add up. What's happening in the confessional? So I talked to a few priests about it and they all agreed. Very little was happening in the confessional. So it was clear that a lot of people just didn't understand that you had to be in a state of grace, and it's very offensive to Jesus to go and receive him when you're not. And people don't do this with bad intent, they just do it out of a lack of understanding. And also people go up and just don't give dignity to his altar, an expression that Jesus has used to kata you. The way they dress, the way they'll sometimes talk to somebody else in the line going up to receive the Eucharist, not realising that if they really accepted the truth of the Eucharist, that Jesus is truly alive and present, flesh and blood, I mean, you'd be overawed. Imagine if I said to you now, you're not going to believe this, but Jesus is outside and he's going to talk to 10 of you. Who wants to go out? I mean, it'd be difficult to cope with the reality of meeting Jesus. And yet we say, oh yes, I believe he's in the Eucharist. Do we really believe that? So we made a film on the Eucharist, and we've launched it in a number of countries in I think 4 languages now, and more to come. But there's one little story that I want to tell you which really validates our decision to make this film. In Australia, we went to all the capital cities and had a launch, and they were all very successful. We went to the relatively unknown city of Adelaide, and we had about probably 700 people in the hall. And after showing the film, the priest who was the MC for the night invited people to come up and ask questions. But he said, please, no statements, just questions. After 3 or 4 questions, an elderly man with a white cane, looking very emotional, came up to the microphone, and he said, Father, I know you said no statements, but I would like to make a statement. And he was shaking, clearly emotional. So the priest said, okay, go ahead. He said, well, I just wanted to tell you that I'm blind and I just saw that film. And it was just an awesome moment. You know, you could hear a pin drop as people looked at this beautiful old man, tears rolling down his cheeks. And Ron and I didn't have an opportunity that night to get his story because people wanted to talk and get the videotape and so on. So we flew back to Adelaide, and we'd also been told that there was a blind woman in the audience who also saw it, but a friend told me that she was too shy to come up because it would look like she, in her own words, he'd told the story and she didn't want to look like she was getting on the bandwagon. So this humble blind woman just walked away and didn't say anything. So Ron and I went back, and we had to make sure that his story was true, and we got a statement from his doctor saying he was 95% blind. Went to his house and we saw where his chair was positioned with a piece of tape on the floor. So he was with the exact distance from the television because he had an old optical instrument, and even focusing, he had some tape on it so that he couldn't lose focus. And I asked him what he saw through it. He said, oh, just a bit of movement, but it helps me watch television. And he'd actually bought this to watch our film, The Eucharist, but it didn't work, and he was really disappointed. And he told us on the night that it was from the opening frame of the film. He saw it in full colour, he saw it to the closing credits, then lost his sight again. And in a beautiful act of faith, he said, I don't know what would have been better, whether Jesus had given me back my sight or just that gift of allowing me to see this film on the Eucharist. And he told us of 2 specific shots because we were sort of quietly cross-examining him to authenticate his story. He said, I loved that shot with a little girl with flowers in her hair receiving her first Holy Communion on the tongue with all that reverence. It was so beautiful. He said, and I loved that shot of the sacred vessels. It was a beautiful shot. Now, Ron and I, having put the film together, we had discussed the fact that these were the 2 best shots we had in a 35-minute film. And at least 1 million people have seen that film. EWTN plays it every Feast of Corpus Christi, plus our distribution of the DVD. But only a blind man has told us they were the best 2 shots in the film. So he was very authentic, and he was a lovely old man. His 2 sons converted as a result of that, and one of them actually started evangelising, called me and asked for some DVDs because he wanted to make sure that other people saw it. So a lot of good things have happened and they're still happening. To be a part of this journey has been, I think, to be a witness to what will become a very important part of our church's history. And to go to Lanciano and see that 1,200-year-old lump of blood and know that is almost certainly the blood of Jesus, and that what was a host, a piece of bread originally, is now a piece of flesh torn, and the scientists tell us absolutely that that is human flesh, human blood, and it did come from that host and that wine at the moment of consecration. And then to continue the journey to Argentina and to be with Ron, and we're talking with Dr. Zugaby, when he said, as Ron told you, I can tell you exactly where this piece of heart tissue comes from. And we looked at each other and we knew where he would put his finger on the diagram of the heart, because we'd seen the diagram of the heart of Lanciano, and we just instinctively knew this is authentic. It will be exactly the same part of the heart. And it was. 2 bleeding hosts, 1,200 years apart, and scientists have found that there's heart tissue in each and exactly the same part of the heart. To witness Cartier's stigmata, I now believe I was witnessing the Passion of Christ. It's been an extraordinary journey. The one thing I want to add about the bleeding statue is I couldn't take that any further because we couldn't get a DNA profile from the blood. So as a journalist, I couldn't say this is the real thing. But when we did the pathology on the bleeding host of Argentina, which was very specific and authenticated it totally, especially as it matched Lanciano 1,200 years before, except it had the addition of living white cells, which is extraordinary. All the scientists we talked to said, no, you've got that wrong. This came from a living heart. It hasn't been in water for 4 years, but it had been. So the message was very strong. But when, now knowing that the Argentine host was authentic, and again failing to get the DNA when everything was perfect for the scientists, that now validated the mystery of the blood of the bleeding statue of Cochabamba. It now made sense. And we're working on a third case, which has already given us that same mysterious dimension. But whereas that mystery at first seemed to be a failure in our testing, is now becoming very positive, and is almost certainly telling us that we won't get the DNA of Jesus because firstly, he didn't have a father, and secondly, he was the creator. He was there before he created us. And our belief now is that we won't get that, but if we continue to get the same mystery, then that in itself will be a proof. And I believe it will lead us, and if not us, then our successors in this work, to the shroud. And when the shroud is authenticated, and the sudarium, the face cloth mentioned in John's Gospel, remember the second cloth when Peter and John went to the tomb, the second smaller cloth rolled up against the wall, that exists in a city called Oviedo in Spain. Ron and I have seen it. And when we complete this picture, or as I say, if our successors have to do it, and that'll be fine by me, that completely endorses the truth of the story of Jesus Christ and his passion, his death, and I believe his resurrection. So it's a great story. It's worth all the effort we've put in. It's very rewarding. I just want to leave you with one thought. Most of what we're doing still has some distance to go. But out of all of this, the biggest thing we've learned is what Pope John Paul II told us, that the Eucharist is the source and summit of Christian life. And I have learned the value of it, and it's been of immense benefit to me to know that, and to go to Mass accordingly, and confession, and receive communion like it is an extraordinary gift. When you receive communion, do it well, and know that you are going to go up to the altar and be embraced by your Creator, your Saviour, your God. Thank you.